Organizations during turbulent times are striving to switch to a more situational leadership role by inculcating empathy as a top leadership skill in today's world of work. Talking Point connects with Nicklin, best-selling author and CEO of Empathy Everywhere. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
For business leaders of today, the challenges is to create a corporate culture of openness and diversity that is responsive to the concerns of employees and customers. Is there a limitation when it comes to empathy?
Oh, what a great question. No, there isn't. There actually isn't. When you look at the data, what we know about empathy, especially in the organization, is that the higher the levels of empathy, which for everybody listening, we're fundamentally talking about understanding. So the higher the level of understanding in that organization, whether that's between peers or between leadership and their teams, the higher the performances of the business. In fact, nearly every performance indicator improves when empathy goes up. So no, there's no limit. What we know is that output goes up, performance per capita goes up, motivation, tenure, loyalty, innovation, creativity. So quite honestly, Sabrina, no, the higher that level of understanding as human beings, the better we perform in our organizations.
Empathy is the ability where an individual should try and understand others' emotions. This is also one of the core competencies of emotional intelligence and critical leadership skill. How should organizations embrace this so-called transformation?
It is a transformation, and there's never been a time actually when leaders needed empathy, emotional intelligence, connection with their staff more than now. Part of that has been the changing world since 2020, and part of that was COVID, but not all of it. I think we often overstate the role of COVID in changing our leadership today. Our leadership needs to change because the world is changing, because the people we are bringing up in our organizations are changing. And that Gen Z workforce is going to demand a far more listening-led organization. There are actually no humans that don't have the need to be seen and heard. That is universal. We are born like that. In fact, when two babies are born equally sick, the one that will survive longer is the one that has access to more empathy, to more emotional connection, to more engagement. As humans, we thrive when we're connected. So in the workplace, the way we're seeing trends across the world, here in Sri Lanka, but globally as well, is this higher need for engagement, for understanding. See me for who I am, hear my opinion, allow me to contribute. So those days, particularly here in Sri Lanka and in South Asia, where we would have 30 people in a meeting and only one person spoke, those days have gone, right? Today, what the workforce needs at all levels is the ability to contribute, the ability to matter, to feel their value. And it's the organizations that get that right that are both thriving, but are also keeping their talent, stopping them from leaving, both from their organization or perhaps from Sri Lanka altogether.
Do you think certain industries have still not looked into this entire platform of empathy that should be on board in their so-called organizations? Do you see certain industries?
I think overall there has been a fundamental shift across industries. So when I started on this journey, Sabrina, it was 2018, and there were very few people talking about this, particularly in the corporate world. So I was quite alone in those days. When you look at it today, across the board it has shifted. But yes, I would say there are certainly some industries that are more open to this than others. The creative industries are ahead. Healthcare, very ahead. In fact, lots of the data around the power of empathy to change leadership, to impact teams, comes from the healthcare and the hospital sector. Banking, catching up, but I would say that's an industry that probably has some work to be done. But here in Sri Lanka, some of my most prominent clients are in the banking sector. So it is changing. I often meet with the legal sector who tell me they need it more than any. So there are still some industries where that very kind of autocratic, tough, hard-edged leadership is entrenched. But it is the leaders that realize the end is nigh. They just won't get away with it anymore. The world is so small and so connected, and we have so much choice. We have so much choice as employees that if you don't find a leader that inspires you, 79% of people, and this data is from a study of 6,000 people, big study, 79% of people said they would leave their job, their experience, and their industry to find a boss that will listen to them more. So I believe that's what's behind the Great Resignation. People are voting with their feet. If you don't hear them, they'll find someone who will.
We are experiencing and in the middle of a socio-economic turbulence that stresses and demands right leadership to ensure proper management systems to be implemented throughout an organization. Empathy is certainly in high demand since it goes beyond sympathy. Therefore, tell us more about this approach that should be adapted by leaders.
There are still so many people who don't know what empathy in leadership means, Sabrina. So often I talk about listening-led leadership because fundamentally the backbone to empathy in an organization is the ability to listen. The key misconception is that empathy is an emotion or something emotional, which is absolutely incorrect. Empathy is a data set. It is a skill set. It is something that you can master and improve at. All of us are born with this skill set. I think I touched on earlier, this is a pro-social skill set. It makes us human. In fact, without empathy, we can't survive as human beings. Not thrive, survive, right? We need each other. We need to be able to work together as communities, as tribes in the very beginning. So empathy is around having the data, the human data in your workforce to know, why is your business growing or not growing? Could it be growing more? You know, one of the questions I often get asked is, my organization is doing fine, why do I need a change? Well, the question is, wouldn't you rather be doing great, right? So fundamentally, this skill set is the ability to close the gaps between different groups of your organization, whether that's getting your teams to work better together, higher levels of collaboration, communication, resilience, speed, efficiency, because they are able to understand each other. Or it could be gaps between the top and the bottom. A lot of my work is in multi-generational leadership. Today, for the first time, we have 5 generations in one workplace. There is a very big gap between how a 75-year-old and a 17-year-old works and communicates. Understanding how to get the best out of both is where empathy comes in. So what we're talking about is listening-led leadership. What we're talking about, as you quite rightly said, is using emotional intelligence skills, or what we call today social intelligence skills, to understand human beings. But this is not about being emotional. This is not about being soft. This is hard to find, hard to master, and hard to maintain. It is also a hard metric in performance. So there really has been no better time to do it. And that's why so many clients and teams around the world are investing in upskilling their workforces in this now.
I have a cross question. Since you travel quite a lot around the globe and your organization is empathy everywhere, have you noticed in any particular country or in a part of a continent where they have actually performed exceptionally well, where leaders do sincerely have empathy in them?
Yeah.
Could you quote a country or a situation or an example?
I wish I could. On a social level, yes. So on a social level, what we see is between different societies, we have either collectivist or individualistic societies. In Asia, we find many collectivist societies, in Africa as well, some of the Middle East. The Western markets tend to be, bit of a judgment, but tend to be more individualistic markets. There are higher levels of natural empathy in collectivist societies. So as I travel from a social context point of view, when I'm looking around a room, I'm in an environment, you can see countries that have higher levels of shared empathy. India is one of them. For example, parts of Africa, you see it a lot as well. In the workplace, I think it's less to do with countries and more to do with the type of leadership and the sophistication of that leadership in those countries. So I have seen, brilliant cases and disasters within the same environment. But I do think culture plays a big role. Within a cultural context, you talk about high versus low context cultures. Sri Lanka is a high context country. That means that when we lead, it's never quite as straightforward as it seems, right? Someone is saying one thing but meaning another, or they might be sitting in one way but responding another. Or there might be people in a group who in the business hold one rank but in society hold a different rank. So it can get quite complicated. So the answer is no. There's not a hard and fast definition between nationalities, but there are certainly social dynamics in those markets that make empathy more natural in one versus another.
Certainly. Empathy can be further defined as a force for innovation, flourishing enterprises, and an approach that is intent to stay. Explain to us about empathetic leaders, how they foster work-life integration among their employees.
So I'm a great believer, and you used the word integration. I'm so happy you did. I'm a great believer in the integration of work and life and not the balance. Mm-hmm. I think the balance is gone, right? I think that was,
that's an old-fashioned term.
Yes, maybe in like the 1980s we could have some balance. The world is so integrated now, not just because of the times that we live in, but the way we integrate with social media, the way we travel, how close the world is. So I think really for leaders today, and I was with a leadership team yesterday in India, in fact, and one of their biggest challenges they were saying to me is, how do we help people create this elusive balance while still protecting performance? Because we want people to be well, we want them to bring their best selves, but of course they have to deliver on the bottom line at the same time. So I think the leaders that are really able to do that have a few values that they get right. One of them is open communication. So really being able to have conversations with your team, that idea of an open door policy where it really is open, right? So they can have those communications and people do not fear to share their opinion. So we talk about high levels of psychological safety, which is a relatively new concept in Sri Lanka and parts of Asia, but is shifting faster in the Western markets like the US and the UK. So open communication ensures that the leader is again able to close those gaps and that their workforce is able to challenge, create, curate, learn in the workplace. Now, when we look at young people today, in the top 5 metrics for why they want to stay in a job, money isn't there. Well, that's wrong. Sometimes it comes in at 3 or 4, but it's not in the top 3. So the top 3 always rotate between a company that shares my values, a company that allows me to learn and grow, and a company that respects who I am. And then there's functional benefits. I need to be paid. I want to make money. Everybody needs money, right? So the open communication allows you to understand what your employees need. What do they want, right? Do they want hybrid working because they are lazy, which is what I hear all the time? Or is there a deeper reason for that, right? And often when leaders come to me and they are finding it challenging to create these environments for their employees, the first thing I ask them, Sabrina, is have you asked them? Have you asked your staff what they want?
Have you had a chat?
Have you had a chat? And 80% of the time they say, oh, well, no. Which leads me to the second value, which is vulnerability, which can be a very scary word, particularly for male leaders. Vulnerability does not mean you have to share, every problem you've ever had in the world and, disclose your whole personal life. That's
irrelevant.
That's irrelevant. But it does mean that you have to be open to having open conversations, right? To hearing what other people think and how, they might have feedback for you, for the working environment. And it can be as simple as giving people permission to speak. So for example, you might say to your staff, I might not have the full picture here. Could you ensure I have all the details? Yeah. Could you give me a little bit more of your opinion here to ensure that I know, the entire client reality that we're facing here? The minute you are that is what I'm talking about, vulnerability. You're saying, I may not have all the answers. Could you step in, right? The minute we create those conversations, you create more balance, that integration. People feel that they're bringing to work more than, an Excel spreadsheet to get a paycheck. So you said it's about having a chat. It's about conversation. It's about hearing people. It's about being open enough to have those discussions and making the time for that. Because empathy has 2 great enemies. One is low time and the other is high stress. Honestly, if we asked all of our audience, they're all going to put their hand up. Who has low time and high stress? Everybody, right? So you have to create the time. But the great news is once your working team gets used to that open communication, that vulnerability, that discussion, they get faster at it. You get faster at it. So that perception that this is going to take me so much time, I don't have time for this, Mimi, we get better and better at it. And the rewards from that investment, they outweigh the costs every time, because you see growth, you see innovation, you see client retention, you see new business improve.
Tell us why leading with empathy is more important than ever before, especially in the corporate sector.
I think we've touched on a few of these things today. I think part of it is the changing workforce, the age of the workforce, what I mentioned earlier about this multi-generational workforce for the first time that we're facing from the top to the bottom. But I also think that it's the world that we live in. The world is very stressful. People live in a constant state of fear. They don't always know that. It might be in the subconscious, right, in our nervous system. Every time you open a social media app, we are confronted with conflict, with war, with cheating, with 100 other things out there, and we cannot hide from it as people. We used to be able to. You work in the media, right? We used to be able to turn on the radio and turn it off, and that was our choice. But today we're bombarded from all levels. What that means is your staff working in your organization need a different version of you and your culture than they did 5 or 10 years ago. So people not only need to be heard and seen in the workplace, to be motivated, to drive their performance, but to survive as humans, to actually create wellness at scale. And again, this isn't about being soft or kind. This is about a prerequisite to keeping your workforce, right? We know that when people are well, they perform better, they perform longer, they perform more sustainably. 76% of people say they will work longer hours for an empathetic boss. Okay, so when we are balancing the physiology of our people, we are making sure they are well, both mentally and physically. They are protecting and sustaining our businesses. Unfortunately, I don't think the world's going to get any easier anytime soon. So the more complicated it gets out there, the more economic, social, political turmoil that we as society live within, whether you are in Sri Lanka or anywhere else, the more you need an organization that understands that every employee is not the same, that sweeping programs and policies aren't okay for everybody, and that you have to have conversation to create conviction.
Healthy conversations should be basically enforced through empathy, so that we could have a more stable-minded set of group of people working for a core interest of looking at the higher revenues in any organization. And I'm sure Mimi Nicklin will readily agree with me on that note.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, to listen is to understand. Curiosity is the core of all empathy. How am I ever going to understand you, have a conversation with you, or motivate you in the workplace if I don't listen to you? We talk a lot about diversity and inclusion in the world of work today. My first question to HR teams or leaders is, do you understand the people you're trying to include? And if not, how are you ever going to include them? So conversation is the core, being able to find a middle ground. The key about active listening, empathetic listening, listening-led leadership, you are not listening to please yourself. You are listening to engage the other, right? So empathetic listening is not about agreeing. It's not about liking. It's not about judging. It's about allowing people the space to communicate, to add what they want to add to the conversation. And my feeling, whether you're in the corporate world or we're looking at peace solutions for civil society, is there's got to be a middle ground, right? Because nobody wins in conflict, whether that's conflict in the boardroom or conflict in a nation. Nobody wins in war. So conversation is probably the currency of today. We were talking about this off air earlier. I don't think our young people are trained in it. I don't think our middle management are trained in it. And to hold a conversation, to empathetically connect, is not just to hear. It's about body language, it's about eye contact, it's about encouragement. I always remember when I was young, somebody told me the most sophisticated form of leadership is comfort with silence. And at the time I was 23 and I could not understand that. But today, as a leader, as someone who travels the world and listens to people and shares stories for a living, I couldn't understand that more. to be comfortable with silence, to give other people the chance to speak, is your shortcut to engagement, to growth, to conversation. So can empathy change the world? Can it change conversation? Hopefully to the highest level. Probably.
A massive yes.
Yes!
Empathy is a simple essence for a glorified leadership. We were engaged in a very empathetic and a very encouraging conversation with Mimi Nicklin, who happens to be the best-selling author as well as the CEO of Empathy Everywhere. Thank you so much for connecting.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.